music in the room or the music or noise in the headphones, because it turns out that there is a lot of quality scientific data out there that speaks to whether or not listening to particular sounds can enhance our cognition. And indeed, the answer is yes, but there are very particular types of things to listen to under very particular types of conditions that allow one to do that. First off, I want to say that people vary tremendously in the extent to which they can tolerate background noise for work. In fact, individuals will vary tremendously from one day to the next, or even within the same day, in the extent to which they can tolerate background noise. I've experienced this myself. There have been times in which I've been working at home and I felt like, for whatever reason, I just could not engage in focus. And what worked to generate more focus for me was to go to a cafe or to a library or someplace where there's actually more commotion, more people moving about, maybe even more noise, maybe even music in the room. And we have to all be in touch with when we want more background noise or when we want less background noise. There is no hard and fast rule. If you look across the literature for studies that involve complete silence or white noise or binaural beats or music or classical music or rock and roll, you can find results to support any type of environment as being more beneficial. However, as we'll talk about in a moment, there are a few types of environments to really avoid and a few types of sounds that really can enhance the cognition and your ability to focus in your workspace environment across the board that really seem to work for all people. Let's talk about background noise to avoid. And here we're talking about background noise to avoid because it actually can cause some pretty severe deficits in cognition. There's a paper, first author Jordan Love, cool name, last author Alexander Francis. The title of the paper has to do with psychophysiological responses to potentially annoying heating, ventilation, and air conditioning noise during mentally demanding work, which is a mouthful. But basically, what this paper identifies is a large data set in which workplace and environmental noise, mostly the humming of air conditioners that's very loud or the humming of heaters that's very loud and ongoing, just incessant, doesn't let up, can really increase mental fatigue and can vastly decrease cognitive performance. And if you're interested in looking at the cognitive performance data, the authors are Banbury and Berry, 2005. That paper is the one that supports the fact that cognitive performance is worse when there's just the hum of an air conditioner in the background or the hum of a heater and otherwise complete silence. There's also evidence, which I discussed on the episode about hearing, which is that in young children, white noise can cause some impairments in the development of the auditory system. Now, I don't want parents to freak out, and if you're exposed to white noise as a sleep aid as a child, which I know many of you were, don't freak out. But it turns out that white noise, especially if it's loud white noise, can cause some disruption in the auditory maps, the representation of different frequencies of sound in the brain that can lead to some deficits in auditory and even language processing. So we really have to be careful about long-term exposure, extended exposure to white noise or kind of air conditioning noise that's really at a high level. I wouldn't worry if it's in the background and it's shutting off and turning on again as the thermostat kicks off and on, but really trying to avoid work in loud, fan-filled or ventilation generating or heat generating environments because it really can cause damage to the auditory system long-term. And as we described, it can impair cognitive performance and overall increase fatigue. I think we've all experienced that when you're in a room and there's some ongoing background noise and all of a sudden it stops and you just feel this enormous relief. And the reason for this is that our auditory system has a parallel to our visual system. In our visual system, that light entering the eyes triggers the activation of those melanopsin cells, which triggers activation of the hypothalamus, a particular area of the hypothalamus, which generates alertness, generates the release even of cortisol, a stress hormone. In the auditory system, when there's ongoing sound, your auditory system hears that even if you're not paying attention to it. If you're paying attention to something else, it still registers. Those little hair cells, as they're called in your inner ear, are fluttering. The eardrum is beating in concert to that sound frequency. And there's a brainstem mechanism that generates alertness and a kind of vigilance. So when you have a sound that's ongoing in the background, it shuts off. All of a sudden you experience that peace, which is the turning off of those brainstem circuits that are associated with vigilance. Done in a restricted way, meaning not for hours and hours, but maybe if your focus is waning and you're having a hard time engaging in work, you might put on some brown noise or white noise or pink noise and work that way for 45 minutes or so before you go to your panoramic vision walk and get some sunlight. That should be fine. There's really no reason to suspect, however, that those particular patterns of noise are going to optimize particular mental functions. So what I'd like to turn to next are particular patterns of sounds that indeed have been shown in peer-reviewed studies to optimize certain types of mental processing, because you can incorporate these into your optimized workspace environment through headphones or through speakers, whatever mechanism that you want, in order to get more out of your work efforts. If you were to search for apps or go online and try and find sounds that can improve thinking or change your emotions, you're generally going to find three types. One are called isochronic tones. These are tones usually of a common frequency. So it might be a beep and then a pause and then beep of the same frequency and then beep. Forgive my terrible beeping. I don't know what good beeping would sound like, but contrast isochronic tones with monaural beats. Monaural beats would be repetitive, almost percussive-like beats delivered to just one ear. Toon, 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 this kind of thing. Okay, you can find apps that can deliver monaural beats. You can find also apps that deliver so-called binaural beats. You can also find YouTube scripts or channels that will deliver binaural beats. Binaural beats, as the name suggests, are beats delivered to the two ears. One pattern of kind of percussive beat to one ear and a different pattern, or at least a pattern that's out of phase, that's not synchronized, delivered to the other ear. So on one ear you hear do 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 do, and in the other ear you've got doon doon doon. And what happens is, because of the way that the auditory system converges in the brainstem and generates what are called intraoral time differences. I'll explain what that means in a moment. Intraoral time differences. The difference between the two patterns of beats that are heard by each of the two different ears leads to a third pattern that the brain entrains to and kind of maps onto and generates particular types of brain waves. Okay? So without going into a lot of detail, intraoral time differences are the ways in which, if you were to hear something off to your right, like I just snapped my finger just to the right of my right ear, that a signal arrives in my right ear before that sound signal, those sound waves arrive in my left ear. So there's an intraoral, between ears, time difference. And there's a brainstem area in which signals from one ear and signals from the other ear converge, and there's literally a math done by your nervous system that says this signal arrived before the other signal. And the difference between those signals is the intraoral time difference. So if I were to snap my fingers on both sides, on my left and on my right side at the exact same time, and they arrive at the same time, the intraoral time difference is 0. Whereas if one goes first on the right and then the left, I'm terrible at snapping on the left, it's a weak snap, but it was there, then there's a delay and the intraoral time difference has a particular value. Okay, you get it. It's almost ridiculously simple. Binaural beats have been generated in ways that create a particular pattern of intraoral time differences that then cascades up to the rest of the brain and puts the forebrain and other areas of the brain that are involved in cognition and action into a particular rhythm. And some of the rhythms or waves of brain activity are ones that you may have heard of, things like alpha waves or theta waves or gamma waves. Now, I don't like to get too attached to particular brain waves as excellent for particular kinds of thinking. This is something that was really popular in the 90s and 2000s, when ways of measuring brain activity non-invasively with electrodes on the outside enabled people to identify that indeed alpha brain waves are associated with alertness states, and some are other brain waves that are kind of larger amplitude slow waves like delta waves are associated with kind of sleepiness or relaxation. But in general, the way that the brain works is that different brain waves are generated in different structures at different times, and those combine to give us a sense of happiness or give us a sense of focus or give us a sense of creativity. Nonetheless, if you look across the board at the studies of binaural beats and you ask what sorts of binaural beats appear to be useful for people to enhance their brain function for particular kinds of tasks, we arrive at some very interesting answers. So we'll review what those are now. The frequency of binaural beats that appears to bring about improved cognitive functioning at the level of memory, improved reaction times, and improved verbal recall seems to be 40 hertz. Now, is it exactly 40 hertz? We don't know. But if one wants to look up a great reference on this, the reference Colzatto, Colzato et al., 2017, describes, and here I'm quoting, so this is a direct quote, "The present findings are in line with those of a recent study, which also found faster reaction times in participants that listen to binaural beats of 40 hertz. And you can find many examples of this in the literature, where binaural beats of about 40 hertz, or exactly 40 hertz in some cases, somehow brought the brain into a state that made it optimal for learning, for memory, and for certain types of recall, including verbal recall, math learning, etc. So for those of you that are interested in binaural beats, there are a number of free apps out there. I'm not going to recommend any in particular. You just have to search for one that that you happen to like. One thing that you will find is that many of those apps superimpose binaural beats onto raindrops or ocean sounds, or they superimpose ocean sounds and raindrops onto the binaural beats. That does not appear to be as effective as pure binaural beats. There has been an exploration of lower frequency binaural beats. So for instance, 7 hertz, which is theta binaural beats, done for 30 minutes with an overlay of rain sound or rain sounds only, that's been analyzed. And believe it or not, that showed immediate recall memory was significantly decreased. Okay, so that's a negative effect of binaural beats on memory. So the idea that binaural beats are just great for us across the board, I think is wrong. It does appear that the higher frequency binaural beats, as one moves up toward 40 hertz, are going to be the most beneficial.